In this video, we are looking at one of the past papers from IGCSE Biology syllabus, which is on the distribution of rods and cones in the retina. The question is, the human retina contains receptor cells called rods and cones. Figure 2.1, which is this graph, shows the distribution of receptor cells in a human retina. Using the information in figure 2.1, describe the differences in the distribution of rods and cones. So if we look at the graph here, x-axis shows the distance from the fovea, where fovea is 0 arbitrary units, and y-axis shows the number of receptors per millimeter square. The key over here is showing that rods are shown by the regular solid line and cones are shown by the dotted line. So since we have to focus on the distribution and the differences, let's first look at the rods. So what we see here is this solid line, right, on the entire graph. This solid line here, here, this is always much higher, right? This starts from around 50,000, and even if it is on the other side of the fovea, we see here it's always higher, right? It's going as high as 150,000. But if you see the dotted line, it is close to 0. So that means first point we can say is that the number of rods is much greater than the number of cones. Right? The rods are much greater than the number of cones. That's the first point. Now let's first focus on rods and write everything that we can about rods first. Okay, second thing we notice is, if you look at fovea, right, which is 0 arbitrary unit, do we have any rods here? See, this line is going down, this line is going down, both these lines are touching the x-axis. That means there are no rods present at the fovea. So that is another point which you can write, no rods present at fovea. Let's see what more we see about rods. Third thing, what we can see is, if you see on the either side of the fovea, the number of rod is highest around the fovea, right? So this you can write that the number of rods are very high on either side of the fovea. Either side of fovea. Okay, what else? As we move away from the fovea, the number of rods go on decreasing. That is also another point that you can write. Okay. Then now let's focus on the cones. So what do we see about the cones? The dotted line. So what we see is all this while, from 80 arbitrary units to around 20 or even 10 arbitrary units on both the sides of the fovea, the number of cones on both the sides are almost equal, right? So number of cones on either side of the fovea, on the sides of the fovea, is constant. That is one point we can write about cones. Second, what we can write is, okay, let's see at the fovea. The cones suddenly peak at the fovea. See here, at 0 arbitrary units. So we can write that maximum cones are present at the fovea, or the peak is at the fovea. Okay, and one most important thing that we can see here, okay, that we covered already, that we have a lot more rods compared to cones. Now this question is about the differences. If it was not about the differences, then there is one very good observation that we could have written over here, which is, if you look at this blind spot, right, this is blind spot where we don't have cones or rods. So if the question is only about distribution of rods and cones and not about the difference, because this is a similarity, so we cannot write that in difference. So here it is not a valid point. But in general, if the question is asking about the distribution of rods and cones, then you can write that point as well, that there are no rods or cones present at the blind spot. Okay, so I have already written down these points here, which is like this question here is asked for 4 marks, but in general, this question can also be asked for 5 marks. So, what are the points that you can write? Overall, there are more rods than cones, right? So here you see this line is much higher everywhere. That means number of rod is much higher. No rods present at the fovea that we see here. There are no rods. Number of rods peak either side of the fovea. There's a peak here. There is a peak here. Number of rods greater on left side of the fovea. This point. So if we see over here, the number of rods here, this is the highest number of rods which are present if we look at anywhere else on the graph. Right? So this is also one point that you can write about the comparison, that they are greater on left side. Number of cones peak at the fovea that we have written over here. See, it peaks. Number of cones outside of the fovea approximately equal everywhere. So here you see this line of the cones, this line showing the cones, this is constant on either side. And this one point which is not valid here, but can be valid if only the distribution is asked, then you can write that there are no rods or cones at the blind spot. Okay, so these are your 6 points that you can write. Always better to write. Now this particular question is of 4 marks. So it is always better to write more points. So in case, suppose one of the points is not valid, you will still get full marks. I hope this graph is clear. If you still have any questions, please write in the comments. We can discuss.